Hi everyone. So the video you're about to watch, I actually split out from my 10-month update video because it got a little bit long. But it's about this discussion about having a split between listening and reading dominant languages, and I hope it'll be interesting to all of you. I might actually make it public earlier. I'm not really sure, but anyway, I hope you enjoy. So the second thing I want to talk about today is this discussion that's been going on in the language learning community recently about the idea that there are these two pillars or two kinds of language acquisition or like language formation that can occur in the brain of a language learner, including natives. So, and give you my take on it. So my take on this has changed a couple of times, as I mentioned before, and I'm sure it'll change again. But I might as well talk about what I think, so that other people can we can have this discussion about what other people's opinions are, and also so I can see what my opinions will be in the future. So the argument goes that there are two ways that you can construct a model of a language in someone's mind when they're learning a language, and that once you've constructed this model of a language, it is basically impossible to change it, or it is very difficult to change it. So before I talk about this, I want to caveat it by, as far as I know, there's no actual like research into this. This is purely speculation. As far as I know, most of it comes from Matt vs Japan, the guy behind Refold. That's the main person that's discussing this. I haven't heard really. There are the other people discussing it are people who are involved in the community, and as far as I can tell, he sort of was like the genesis of the discussion, as far as I know. So I'll talk a little bit about the theory, and then I'll talk a little bit about what my opinion is on Matt's view of it. So, or what I understand of his view on it. So the idea goes that there are two ways that you can construct a model of a language. You can either have reading dominant or listening dominant version of a language. So reading dominant is what most non-native speakers would learn, which is basically that the first encounter you have with the language and the majority of the time you spend with the language, especially in the early stages, is with the written form. So you learn to read the obviously the writing style, the writing system of the language, but you basically learn all vocabulary, and everything that you learn is through the lens of the written form of the language. Now, it's not literally all, but like at least the majority is. And then alternatively, there is the listening dominant version of like the language we can have, which is, the argument goes, is basically what native speakers experience, which is because native speakers obviously became by nature they become fluent in the spoken form of the language far beyond, like way before they even start learning to read. Like children, they learn to speak and they learn to listen to their parents far, like way beyond, way before they start reading. And that's true of basically any human language, any human society that exists at the moment, because structurally speaking, like it wouldn't be possible for children to communicate with their parents if they didn't first know how to speak with their parents, and that overrides the need to learn to read eventually. And also, you can make the argument that actually humans didn't really evolve for reading. Reading was something that we developed later. Reading and writing, the spoken form of language, is something that you could argue is more innate to human society, especially given that the vast majority of language is actually not only spoken but not written. Anyway, the point is that there are these two arguments, and the argument goes is that the listening dominant approach is, if you wanted to make the argument of like pure language acquisition perfection, that would be the way to go. That's the argument. Because constructing this model of the language the same way that a toddler would construct the model of the language, in theory, would give you a better accent. That's the way the theory goes, and you would be able, far better at being able to accurately represent, like basically it would be. And note that this is actually not coming from the discussion of like acquiring grammar and acquiring like the correct way of, like the natural way of speaking a language. This is purely about accent, is the main argument is. And then the second, and obviously with people who reading, they struggle because they learnt the writing system, they learned the formalized system of how the sound system works through writing. When they listen to things, their brain is actually interpreting what they're hearing through the filter of what their internalized model of the sound system is, which is actually not based on the real sound system that they didn't acquire the sound system itself. They acquired a effectively a model of the sound system that they learned through the written form. That's the argument. And then since they learned it in isolation, then they would basically, it's much more difficult to reverse this case. And then the other argument goes, the other and the other anecdote, and I should talk about that in a second. But yeah, the other anecdote goes that this model of the language effectively the reading dominant model of the language sort of precludes certain abilities when it comes to acquiring new words that are purely spoken. That's the way the argument goes. So, what is my opinion on this? So, My opinion on this is that I'm not entirely convinced that in the absolutist terms that it's sold. I think there is an argument that um, that some people may feel so in terms of the model. So the model I'm not sure is entirely accurate. And the reason I don't think it's entirely accurate is because I don't think that it has good predictive abilities. Effectively, I think that it's whether or not it's true or not. It sort of depends. Like it's sort of very difficult to test what sort of model a person has. So the only thing you can really look at is sort of the results. Classic scientific method style. So as a result, I think there is the fair question that should be asked, which is, what is the distinction between these two types of language learner, and how can we really tell, is there actually a difference? So the main argument goes that listening dominant learners will have better accents. That's basically the one thing that is agreed upon. The other thing that has been mentioned by Matt is that he feels that, and he is contrasting himself with another learner who he argues is far more listening dominant than him. He says that he is more reading dominant. So, in terms of listening dominance, so he says that the other person, I don't know who the language learner is. It's someone he knows. But anyway, his idea is that this person is much better at picking up picking up words when they're spoken, while Matt requires the word to be written in order for him to fully understand it. So that's the comparison that he personally has made between what he feels is someone he has identified as a listening dominant speaker to himself, who he argues is a reading dominant learner, or reading dominant Japanese speaker. So what are my thoughts of this? I think that the accent thing is basically untestable. At least it's not practically testable. Like you would need to. I think that basically this boils down to there are I've only heard of 2 actual anecdotes of people who you could reasonably argue match this mold, and this is all based on subjective views of people who are non-natives. So I think that on several levels this is not really evidence. You could maybe use it as evidence to argue that we should look into it, but it's not evidence in of itself. And also in order to test it, you would need to have an actual testing regime. And I think that even though there are some people who are now trying to pursue this listening only approach, how would you actually determine that they would follow it? And also there's a selection bias going on where people who are more interested in having a good accent are people who would be more attracted by this idea of becoming listening dominant, which means that even if it was the case that these people had better accents in the long term, you couldn't really prove that it was this particular aspect of their learning that caused it. It could be just the case that people who are more motivated to improve their accent have better accents. It might be that the people who are naturally going to be better at producing a better accent will then be motivated to have a good accent, which would then lead them to this thing. So it could be any level of degrees of separation from the actual cause. Correlations or causation. So that's the main problem with this theory, is that it's very difficult to test, if we could ever test it. And also the way that it's currently being tested is through a handful of anecdotes, which I would argue are not even tested to a very strong scrutiny in of themselves. And then you have this other aspect, which is they you couldn't really test it with a group of people that are currently would be interested in doing language learning, and it's such a long and arduous journey that you couldn't take uninterested people and get them to do it. So I think that practically speaking, it's untestable. So the only thing you can really compare is the subjective experience of people in terms of how they acquire vocabulary. This is the other example that Matt uses. So this one is also a can of worms, because subjective experiences of how you interpret learning a new word are very difficult, because after all, native speakers learn words in a rate that is not, in many ways it's subconscious. It's not something that people notice. So there are studies that show that the average native speaker learns about 1 new word a day, even if they weren't aware that they learned it. Or rather, that it's usually an unconscious process, so they're not even aware that they're learning a new word. So as a result, I think that this is also difficult to test. Though you can actually ask native speakers what their experience is, because again, the theory is that the vast majority of second language or non-native speakers in a language even fluent speakers are reading dominant, and that the vast majority of native speakers, or I would say basically 100% of native speakers, are listening dominant. So therefore, if you asked native speakers what their experience is, and then you ask second language speakers what their experience is, if there is a distinction with these experiences, but they're both at like approximately the same level of ability in language, you could then make a distinction. And now this is again anecdotal. I don't know that there's no research that's been done into this topic. So I went and I asked some people that I know who are non-native speakers in various languages, and also who are actually in English. English is all their non-native languages, and I also asked them what their experience is in their native language. So I'm Serbian. I'm Serbian heritage. I speak Serbian as a heritage language, so I don't think that really counts. But my mom obviously is a Serbian native speaker who speaks, who learned English. She learned it in school, again, mainly through reading. So, I mean, they didn't really encounter the spoken form of English for quite a while in school. So I asked her what her opinion is, and yeah, I'm actually, let's just go through all the people that I talked about, and then we can talk about what their overarching point is. My partner is Vietnamese, but she learned English in Vietnam, and I have a friend who's Japanese, whose native language is Japanese, and they obviously learned English as a second language. So the overarching point of all these people that I've asked is that, and also I compared my own experience in Serbian and also in English. I obviously can't compare it in any other. I haven't really learned another foreign language to a native level, or a high level, so I can't really compare that aspect. But I can compare my own experience of the languages that I know natively. So my experience asking people, I do get the impression that second language speakers are more comfortable with the written form of the language than the spoken form of the language, in that they find it easier to remember words and get a grasp on words when they're written. So I think that is definitely true. Now, the real question is it the case that in their native language they also feel that way? And this is where the split happens. So Serbian and Vietnamese have phonetic writing systems. Now, I thought this wouldn't have an impact, because it's sort of a bit of a cheat, I think, to sort of discuss that, because the phonetic writing system, there is no distinction between the two. I think there is some truth to that, maybe, but, whatever. So, my mom and my girlfriend, they aren't sure, basically, what it boils down to. My girlfriend thinks that she does like having the written form of the language spelled out to her, like to have it written, but that she wouldn't struggle remembering a word if she first heard it spoken. My mom, she can't really say, because so the only time she can remember encountering an unknown word is when she speaks to her mom, so my grandmother. But they speak, they speak to each other. They don't write to each other. So she can't really compare it. She thinks that she feels that she might be able to pick it up better if it's written, but she doesn't have experience to go off of. So she's not sure. So for both these cases, they're not really sure. For the Japanese case, actually, my friend said that his experience is that it's easier for him to remember a word when it's spoken, but he feels he has a better understanding of it when it's written, because of kanji. And I think that's one, again, this is all one person's experience, but it is interesting, and I think that it does sort of get into the topic of, I'm not entirely sure the native speakers actually do have this major split between how they acquire vocabulary, like how they feel themselves acquiring vocabulary. I'm not actually sure that's real, because first of all, all the people that I've asked, they can't really tell, and the fact that they can't tell sort of tells me that it's questionable whether that actually is true. My experience, and it's just about my experience. So my experience with English is that I do definitely feel that I can pick up spoken words just as easily as written words. I think there are some aspects to which a written word gives me a better grasp on the word, especially if it's a somewhat archaic word. I get the impression that I can get a better idea of where the word came from or the etymology of the word if it's written. If it's spoken, you can't really pick that up. That's my experience with English. With Serbian, my reading ability in Serbian is quite bad. I'm hoping one day to improve it. But my reading experience of Serbian is that I suck at it so badly that my entire experience with the Serbian language is basically spoken only. I do sometimes read Serbian stuff, and I have family and friends who write stuff on social media in Serbian, so I do read it sometimes. But my experience is that my knowledge of Serbian is, to me, effectively, it's a spoken language only. And so I actually feel a huge difference in my experience of English and Serbian because of this handicap that I have on myself. Which is that because the written form is something that I'm not used to at all, I experience spoken words far, like I grasp on them far better than when they're written down. When they're written down, I actually have to sound out a word. Sometimes I read a word and I don't recognize that it's a word I know until I sound it out and I'm like, oh, actually, I do know what that word is. I just didn't recognize it when it was written. And that's my experience with Serbian. So now, obviously, I'm not a native speaker in Serbian. I'm a heritage speaker, but that's my experience. So I think that arguably this split, insofar as it exists, I think is more about your. I think it's got more to do with your what you're used to, with what you've exercised. I think that in many respects, language ability is like a muscle, or rather, it's a set of separate skills that you train separately. And so the fact that some people have this experience where the spoken form is easier than the written form, I think actually boils down to, or vice versa, it boils down to, I think, practice. Is my experience. Again, I haven't gone through it myself, so I can't really say if you actually can make the switch to one or the other, where one is easier than the other. But I just don't see how you can have such disparate experiences for people who are natives in terms of how they feel about learning new words, which again is the only real comparison we can make, practically speaking, is insofar as it's a testable theory. So in this one aspect which can be tested, it's not even clear that there is a distinction in my mind, and the fact that in English and Serbian, I have such different views in Serbian and English in terms of which one is easier, sort of tells me it's got far more to do with practice than anything else. So that's my opinion on the theory. I want to quickly talk about Matt's anecdote. So the one thing that I've noticed about Matt is that he does, despite the fact that he talks about how much he cares about his accent and all the rest of it, he still, even recent interviews, he discusses the fact that he spends a lot of time reading still. And there's nothing wrong with this, of course. I'm just trying to say that I think that my view is that his experience of Japanese is still very reading focused, and I think that it's very difficult, I would argue, for him to actually have a strong opinion on listening dominance, or this idea of listening dominance in a language, given that he has not personally experienced like cutting off all reading for like a year. Like, he's never done that, and I think that if he did, that would be a fair obviously it would be an interesting anecdote on the question of, is this something that is ingrained to your language ability which you cannot change? Because again, this theory doesn't just posit that there are people who are dominant in one or the other. Maybe that is true, but the theory goes is that once you are stuck in one of these, it's basically impossible to switch to the other one. And I don't know how much of that is true. I also think the question of accent probably boils far more down to practice again. Because there are aspects of our like vocal pathway, like every aspect of us enunciating words is so ingrained by something we've done ever since we were a child in our native language that it's like it would be difficult, I would argue, for someone to really change it in like a way that makes them sound like a native speaker. Again, native speakers have had a lifetime of experience producing the same set of sounds and hearing the same set of sounds, and I think that even if we argue that like intellectually you can acquire a language to a perfect level, let's argue that is even impossible, that still doesn't mean that you can acquire the muscle memory in like your larynx and your vocal cords and your diaphragm and everywhere else that is involved in you producing speech, that you would actually be able to have the same muscle memory through acquisition. I just don't think, I think that's obviously not true, and I think Matt would agree that's not true, because a deliberate practice of speaking through shadowing and stuff like that is something that is recommended by Refold. So, given all of that, I think that has a much bigger impact, and I think this theoretical argument of dominance in languages is sort of, I wouldn't say a waste of time. I think that it's something which is interesting to discuss, but I think that I just don't feel is true, is my opinion. Yeah. So that's my opinion on that. Sorry, it got a little bit long. I'm probably gonna read this as a second video then. And yeah. Thanks. See you around.